How you doing there, folks? Welcome to Trasnatira and Limavady Area Ancestry. You'll notice from the format tonight it's a bit different, and that's because Trasnatira has upgraded to Zoom webinar. This basically gives greater control and no one now can disrupt recordings and stuff like that there, you know. So tonight we have Jim O'Neill. Jim O'Neill's penned this brilliant book on the 9 Years' War, and really, with this book and the amount of information in it, he's probably the foremost authority on the 9 Years' War period, you know. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Jim here. Okay, thank you for all calling in tonight.
Okay, look, thanks so much, Stephen. What we're going to do tonight, I was just saying to Stephen there, rather than just give you the story of the 9 Years' War, which is just a straightforward narrative, it's trying to pick holes in the bits that are sort of misconceived or some have been developed in myth. And just try and pick at the more surprising elements of it, or things that people are somehow not myths have been busy permeated through the historiography that perhaps it doesn't quite fit. So I'll start sharing this screen. Bear with me just a wee sec. Hopefully this works. Right, have you got it now? Let's see. All right, you got it?
Yep, that's it, Jim.
Okay, well, that's working. Okay, we'll get cracking and see where we go. Okay, so the 9 Years' War, also known as Tyrone's Rebellion, appears in popular image as an irregular war of ambush and retreat fought by Irish lords to throw off English rule. Now, this is ultimately doomed to failure, as primitive Ireland could never hope to match the economic and military strength of Glory Island as England. God forbid, heaven forfend. Moreover, the war gave rise to greater levels of savagery and civilian victimization than warfare in the rest of Western Europe. Now, this appears very neat and uncontentious when one considers continuing controversies raised by the wars of the 1640s. However, the narrative is riven with fabrications which began during the war, and to tell you the truth, have kept on going ever since. Now, deconstruction of assumptions about the conflict show that many of them aren't supported by the evidence. This is actually a thing from when I used to do archaeology. Take it apart and then you start to see how things are built. The key strands of the myth are of particular concern, and that's the primitivism displayed by the Irish and the brutalities of the war in a backward society. In military terms, the Irish were anything but primitive, and indeed in many ways they were more advanced than the English adversaries. Therefore, I'll explore how and why the Irish writers have sought to portray the Irish as crude and unsophisticated for 400 years. Furthermore, the modern vogue of equating the closing stages of the war with genocide is founded on somewhat iffy sources. So this reassessment of the contemporary account suggests that the horrors of Ulster were overstated at the time, and later interpretations have emphasized aspects of the devastation caused by the 9 Years' War to apportion blame to one side of the conflict, which my God rest and father would have loved, but unfortunately I can't prove. But they've tried to apportion that blame to the English. Now, the 9 Years' War represented both the peak of Gaelic martial ability and the final destruction of the native military and political power. However, there remains a popular perception that the war was a contest between the relatively backward and military weak Irish and the modern and comparatively sophisticated armies of Elizabeth I. But this is far from the reality of war in Ireland at the end of the 16th century. Now, this guy, and I mean the guy with the moustache, I hate this guy, and I'll tell you why. The historian John Keegan noted that the way people fought was an expression of native culture, and following on from this, the image of the primitive and obsolete styles of warfare by the native Irish could imply a culture that was also archaic and resistant to change. And indeed, the proclivity to or rejection of change has been an ongoing debate in the historiography of early modern Ireland. But the 9 Years' War wasn't the clash of cultures with pike and shot forces of England being initially bested by the noble and plucky but primitive Irish in a courageous but inevitably doomed effort to throw off English rule, but one which bore many of the hallmarks of warfare which were raging in France and the Low Countries. This stereotypical native host of armoured gallowglass, Kern and Scottish mercenaries had little part to play in a war where for the most part military pragmatism and innovation dominated. However, there's much of the literature to convince the contemporary audience, and even the modern historians for that matter, that the Irish were base and bestial in nature. In 1571, in his History of Ireland, Edmund Campion described the Irish as bestial, whereas in 1596, Edmund Spencer piles on with both and compares the Irish to Scythians, the archetypal barbarian from classical Greek literature. Illustrations help reinforce the contemporary and modern perceptions of the Irish as unsophisticated and primitive. As you see, Albert Durer in 1521 to John Derrick in 1581 also show the Irish as decidedly archaic, almost medieval. This negative view is correspondingly compounded by the contemporary Irish chroniclers who hark back to a golden age of Irish warrior myth. This native representation of Irish warfare is deliberately what is called archaized, and this is evident in the accounts of the English and Irish preparations before the Battle of the Yellow Ford in 1598, as documented in the Life of Red Hugh O'Neill by O'Clery, who described the Irish as armed with traditional spears and swords, whereas the English were equipped with modern firearms and pikes. The distinction is clearly made that the English were well armed and equipped with modern arms, whereas the Irish were equipped with the weapons of their mythic ancestors. Excuse me. In reality, the Irish were far more dependent on firepower than the English. Perhaps this narrative from both the English and Irish sources made it more likely of the image of the primitive to endure. The iconic Irish primitive warrior has been maintained by Irish nationalist movements, which idealized a pre-conquest Ireland. And the Celticism of the 19th century created a cultural history which imagined and idealized identity. You've all seen it. Murals across Northern Ireland deploy this imagery to promote modern political and social agendas. And this image of the primitive Irish suited both nationalist and unionist interpretations of history. For one, it fit into the pure Celtic ideal. For the other, it confirmed the backwardness of Ireland and need of outside intervention to the ultimate benefit of the natives. The image of a modernising Gael would not suit either narrative and may have fallen down the cracks between the nationalist and unionist conceptions of the late 16th century. In other words, that's why no one's ever sees it, because it doesn't suit anyone, so who cares about it? However, despite crafting an iconic image, the war against Tyrone and his allies consumed the wealth and lives and reputations of some of the finest military men in Elizabethan England. But they did not fall to noble savages, but a military machine that was subject to the reforms of the military revolution sweeping Europe at the time. And the man most responsible for this is Hugh O'Neill, second Earl of Tyrone, and he profoundly transformed native Irish forces. Now, O'Neill developed infantry, which utilised the fundamental precepts of the military revolution by building pike and shot-based formations which relied on firearms as the mainstay of their combat power. This made them more in keeping with continental practices than the English, because the Crown forces' willingness to enter melee, in other words, get stuck in with pikemen, was inconsistent with accepted practice in Europe, which viewed firepower as superior to the pike. O'Neill did not slavishly copy European practice, but created a hybrid force which combined the advantages of modern firepower-oriented infantry with the flexible and highly mobile nature of Irish warfare. Furthermore, his military tactics recognised that the landscape of Ireland placed limitations on how and where troops could march and fight, and much of the Irish landscape was covered in scrub woods and bogland, with roads or tracks traversing defiles, passes and rivers. And vegetation and woods inhibited the use of close order pike. Therefore, rather than attempt to impose a new system of infantry on a landscape that didn't suit it, O'Neill adapted the reforms to minimise the restrictive effects of the Irish terrain. And this was a feat which the English were unable to match for most of the war. Now, during most of the major Irish victories over the English, firepower, shooting things, was key to Irish success, and indeed it was the shortage of gunpowder which saved the Crown armies from total destruction at Clontibret in 1595 and at the Yellow Ford in 1598. Where 50 to 60% of the English infantry were equipped with firearms, 80% of those deployed by Tyrone carried calivers, which were a light firearm suited to close range skirmishing rather than the big cumbersome musket, which the English continued to arm the men until late in the war. But the English forces did eventually change, and Lord Deputy Mountjoy, after 1600, adopted many of Tyrone's reforms to make his troops light and correspondingly more mobile in an effort to keep pace with and manoeuvre against their Irish adversaries. That's one of the things actually pressed against. If you look at, say, Cyril Falls, who wrote extensively on this and was the set text for 50 years, he would have you believe that the Irish copied the English, but by the time the war's ended, the English copied the Irish to become more advanced. Anyway, by the closing stages of the war, Sir George Carew was confident that Mountjoy's reforms could easily cope with a second Spanish landing should it arrive, and this is a quote, "We have the same advantage upon them as the Irish have in lightness hath upon us. We should be able to go into any and every part of the province and retreat at our pleasure." And by the end of the war, it was hybridized Irish tactics which were ascendant, not the methods used by the English at the start of the war. Now, even on the most superficial level, from the start of the conflict, it was difficult to differentiate between the English and Irish troops. Irish and English units came to resemble each other in both equipment and formations on the march. And this shouldn't really come as a surprise, as there was frequent references to Irish troops being trained in English ranks, only to defect. And the similarities have near fatal consequences. Hugh Maguire, Lord of Famine, almost fell into an ambush in late 1593 because he thought the English troops on the shoreline were his own. And at the Battle of Yellow Ford, Captain Richard Cooney mistook Captain Billings' regiment in the distance for O'Neill's men. So you can see they can't, it's very hard to distinguish. So there's none of this like Elizabethan troops and Gallowglass. It just wasn't happening. And during the close order encounter in February 1600, Captain Francis Shane mistook Irish soldiers for his own. He actually joined a column of marching troops in Offaly, and he only recognized his mistake when he realized that he didn't have that many men. However, despite the sartorial similarities, others continued to dehumanize the Irish, none less so than Lord Deputy Byrd, who repeatedly described Tyrone as a beast who needed to be run to ground. And Francis Jobson added in 1598 that during his 1591 survey that he found the people of Ulster as rebellious people from whose cruelty God only by his divine power delivered me. And Jobson confirmed their barbarism, attributing the Irish strength to their semi-nomadic crates of cattle. And all this was untrue, as Lord Deputy Mountjoy later discovered that Irish power was based on the wealth of arable, not pastoral agriculture. The myth of the Irish primitiveness led to some confusion with new drafts that were sent to Ireland, leaving some surprise for newcomers. And in 1599, a guy called Robert Osborne, who was part of the reinforcements sent to the Earl of Essex, reported that, and this is a letter to his friend in England. In England, they say that they be but naked rogues. This is the Irish he's talking about. But we find them as good men as those which are sent us, and better. This was mirrored by Thomas Butler, 10th Earl of Ormond, who was captured in 1600. You see the picture here. And he noted that the Irish pike deployed at Barrymore were some of the finest soldiers he'd ever seen in Ireland. Now, Tyrone's destruction of Bagnall's force at the Battle of the Yellow Ford demonstrated that the Irish field tactics could defeat the largest and best equipped English force deployed in Ireland. The English army wasn't overwhelmed with numbers or critically hobbled by poor leadership. Bagnall's men were outfought and routed by disciplined firepower and coordinated battlefield maneuver of Tyrone's infantry and cavalry. The victory wasn't a one-off, nor should it have come as a surprise, to tell you the truth. Over the previous 5 years of war, the Queen's armies had experienced repeated battlefield reverses. Like I said earlier, a shortage of gunpowder saved Bagnall's men at Clontibret. And it was only a fortuitous rainstorm that prevented the destruction of Clifford's command at Ballyshannon in 1597. However, the view that guerrilla or hit and run warfare predominated during the 9 Years' War has managed to endure into modern literature. Yet for most of the war, it was the Irish who held the field at the majority of engagements. It was the English who moved away or broke contact. The assumption that the Irish could only engage the English from relative security of bogs and woods also proved false. O'Neill's defeat at Kinsale has overshadowed all occasions where Confederate forces successfully engaged troops in the open, such as at Mullabrack in County Armagh in 1595, the Toher in County Offaly in 1600, and Benburb in 1601. At Mullabrack, Tyrone's forces' willingness to fight on hard rising ground disconcerted Sir Geoffrey Fenton, who noted that the Irish had engaged in rising ground where there was neither bog nor bush, much to their surprise. Mountjoy's encounter with the Irish fighting in the open at nearby Benburb in 1601 was possibly the most strategically important, as Tyrone's deployment in the open stymied the English push towards Dungannon. The Irish may have lost the largest set-piece battle of the war at Kinsale, but these examples demonstrate that it is a mistake to assume they could not fight effectively away from defiles or advantageous ground. Now, the nature of the conflict has led many to believe that the war was defensive with a focus on fighting in and around Ulster. And on the surface, you'd think that. It appears that due to O'Neill's sophisticated strategy, which fooled the Crown for much of the war, to tell you the truth, for the people reading it afterwards. At an operational level, O'Neill used overt military campaigns to draw English forces away from areas where the Irish sought to expand their political and therefore economic dominance. Irish operations sought to disperse or distract English commanders, ensuring that their troops were poorly sighted or unable to effectively engage O'Neill and his allies. And often O'Neill invited English attacks, causing the war from 1593 to 1590 to appear strategically defensive, but in reality, it was quite the reverse. The Irish use of deception and displacement supported broader strategic needs. And during the closing months of 1596, O'Neill blockaded the garrison in Armagh, compelling the Lord Deputy to gather his army at Dundalk, where he could march to Armagh under the leadership of Sir John Norreys, who is another big hero of Elizabethan England. And as a major engagement appeared imminent, O'Neill relented, allowing the fort to be resupplied. With the government forces now concentrated in the east, O'Donnell embarked on raids targeting Clonrickard, Athlone and Athenry and burnt to the suburbs of Galway town. And it was only when it was too late did it become apparent that Norris had been deliberately drawn away to give O'Donnell free rein in the west. Now, Lord Deputy Burr's offensive in 1597 was frustrated by Irish regional coordination. Burr's plan called for a two-pronged attack. Burr's plan called for a two-pronged attack into Ulster through counties Armagh and Donegal. And with the two armies converging on the Foyle, O'Neill checked Burr on the Blackwater and Clifford at Ballyshannon, then used raids to spoil the borders of the Pale. And while Burr was preoccupied in the north, the rising out of Meath and the Kells garrison were routed by troops led by Captain Richard Tyrrell. Local supply shortages brought on by devastation around Newry and Leakhill, and Tyrrell's activity caused Burr to pull the army back into Monaghan and Cavan, and this released O'Neill's forces, who streamed westwards and almost succeeded in cutting off Clifford's hasty retreat. Strongly engaged by the Irish, Clifford and his men only escaped annihilation because of a providential rainstorm. Now, this is an example of coordinated action between at least three distinct Confederate forces. Tyrrell's victory in Meath could be argued as opportunistic, but it's still achieved against a background of spoliation designed to draw Burr out of Ulster. Now, O'Neill's strategy might have convinced later historic analysis into thinking that the war was defensive, and often when examining the course of the war, one is inclined to concentrate on the fighting. It is, after all, the sexiest, it's got the biggest story, and focus on the action, and it's responsible for consuming lives and treasure, and therefore it's followed, as this must be the side of the greatest importance at the point in the war. However, to paraphrase the Duke of Alba, war is not about fighting, it's about winning. Therefore, for O'Neill, killing English troops was not an end in itself, as disease could kill English armies far more efficiently and cheaper for that matter than Irish guns. Though O'Neill normally only engaged English troops in open combat to support or realise broader strategic aims that were outside the regions experiencing intensive military activity. In other words, to find O'Neill's success in the war, you have to stop looking at the battles. Examination of a pattern of military escalation and Irish raiding shows that it becomes evident that fighting served to leave the rest of the country open to attack by O'Neill and his allies. And the English couldn't be strong everywhere, therefore concentrating forces to combat O'Neill meant that the country was left vulnerable to Irish Confederate raids. And these raids encouraged others to join O'Neill's Confederation and served to impress on the regions attacked that it was O'Neill and not the Crown that was in charge. It was of huge importance in a society where loyalty was predicated on perceptions of military strength. Now, beyond the bloody narrative of combat, the behaviour of the Irish was reported as barbaric and outside the prescribed norms of civilized warfare in England and the continent. The 9 Years' War has often been portrayed as a no-holds-barred conflict where brutality was the norm, and the orgy of bloodshed and cataclysmic famine in Ulster, which brought the war to its close, might have helped cement that image. Now, wars in Ireland were generated a reputation in Europe as one of uncommon savagery, which with later English publications, according to the bulk of that aggression to the Irish. Fynes Morrison, like many others, referred to the Irish tendency to kill all English who fell into their hands, and they described how executioners, by their swiftness of foot upon flying enemies, never sparing any that yielded mercy, yea, being the most bloody and cruel towards their captives upon cold blood, contrary to the practice of all noble enemies. Oh God, those Irish are wild. This attitude is not reflected by officers with experience serving against the Irish, an example of which was Captain Thomas Williams. This hard case was a veteran of continental warfare and was president of some of the most brutal and desperate engagements against Tyrone's men. During one Irish assault at the Blackwater Fort, he castigated his men that no mercy was to be expected from the Irish and that they should hold it shameful to go to their deaths like sheep to the shambles. However, this is all bluster to keep his men at heart, and he later wrote that if he'd surrendered prior to defeat at Yellow Ford, he would have received more generous terms from Tyrone than he did after. Clearly, surrendering to the Irish was not an act of suicide. From the start of the war, Confederate Irish forces showed a greater proclivity to taking prisoners than ground troops. Despite Morrison's claims that the Irish never spared anyone, examination of actions throughout the war proved that Morrison was busy talking out of his hat. The close interaction between the Irish and the Old English families meant that individuals could be saved due to associations before the war. Joan Kelly was rescued by one of O'Neill's Scottish mercenaries at the Battle of the Battle of the Fort of the Biscuits, and Sir Francis Shane, who we mentioned earlier, benefited from Irish acquaintances, but others could be held purely on the basis of their value for prisoner exchange, and they were kept to serve as collateral for bargaining the release of captives in English hands. But being bereft of friends in the Irish ranks and the value of the captive didn't necessarily mean you were dead. The garrisons of both Blackwater forts were permitted to capitulate and leave their charges on terms in 1595 and 1598. And following defeat at the Battle of the Yellow Ford, the shattered remnants of Marshal Henry Bagnall's army were besieged in Armagh, and after 3 days, Bagnall, second in command, Wingfield, negotiated their retreat from Armagh. But what they left behind was a guerrilla insight in the prevailing attitude. Now, what we know is almost half the Crown's field army was killed on their way to the Blackwater fort or trying to run away. And in the life of Hugh O'Neill, O'Clery gruesomely recounted how the Irish returned to the battlefield, stripped the dead, behead the wounded, clearly indicating that the English soldiers received no quarter. So surely everyone's telling the truth. The Irish are brutal. However, Sir James Perrott provided a different insight into the post-battle situation, where he noted how 60 men who had been severely burned in a powder explosion during the battle were left in Armagh Abbey, where the English army retreated to Newry. Now, O'Neill had agreed that the English wounded would be cared for and returned to the Peel when they were well enough to be moved. Now, many succumbed to their wounds, and Perrott condemned O'Neill as several were taken from the Abbey and killed. But those who survived were conveyed to the Peel as agreed. And this incident is revealing for several reasons. It demonstrated that, one, O'Neill and his allies were willing not only to offer quarter, but provide medical aid to wounded English troops at a time when there was absolutely nothing compelling them to. Furthermore, that showed that despite the accusations of barbarity and cruelty by Morrison, experienced English officers had enough confidence in O'Neill's promises to leave 60 incapacitated men in Irish custody. O'Neill and his allies recognised early on in the war that the Crown army could be harmed far more by desertion and surrenders than battle. This was facilitated by offering very liberal terms of surrender and providing generous support and even incentives to deserters from the Royal Army. Now, the events and the historiography of the 9 Years' War may have produced a skewed interpretation of the activities of the Irish, but the royal cause hasn't exactly escaped unscathed. Moreover, the fallacies about the Irish have often been repackaged into a romantic image of the brave but hopeless cause of primitive native. However, the English campaigns have been interpreted by some as unrestrained butchery, typical of the behaviour of colonial conquest of perfidious Albion. This, however, was not always the case. For many years, there has been little effort on the part of Irish historians to engage with the suffering and horrors inflicted on the civilian population in Ireland during the war. And Alfred O'Reilly and D.B. Quinn and Nicholas Canny all touched on the excesses of English aggression towards Ireland. But Bradshaw criticised Irish historians for failing to engage with the impact of violence of atrocity in modern Ireland. Bradshaw's words have very much fallen on fertile ground, and there have been some very strident efforts to make up the deficit, not least among was David Edwards, Clodagh Tate, and Paddy Lennon's edited volume Age of Atrocity, and Vincent Carey's What Pen Can Paint or Tears Atone, Mountjoy's Scorched Earth campaign, and Harry Morgan's Kinsale book. Moreover, their work is percolated into both the modern media and broader studies of the nature of genocide and warfare. And Carey's use of politically charged terms like ethnic cleansing on its own suggests that there was a direct parallel between the policies of the Crown in Ireland and the war crimes of the 20th century. The use of incendiary terminology such as genocidal fury and war crimes by Carey suggests that the pendulum might have swung just a wee bit too far towards the traditional narratives of English cruelty. Now, why pick the Ulster Famine of 1602-03 as an example of English brutality? The well-documented brutality of Humphrey Gilbert during the suppression of the Desmond Revolt in Munster provided a good starting point for the continuity to Tudor barbarity, which culminated in the wanton barbarism in Ulster. Another reason could be the significant amount of suitably lurid and highly quotable accounts of English officers, which made it much easier to paint a picture of bloodthirsty and brutal English soldiers. A favourite was Arthur Chichester, who, by the way, don't get me wrong, is one of the few characters that is irredeemable in this whole phase of the war. He's an absolute charmer. And I mean that in no sarcastic way. Sir Arthur Chichester, who considered the Irish were only worthy of slavery. Moreover, the English were too mild to be their masters, and Chichester boasted that his troops kill a man, woman, child, horse, beast, or whatever we found. And Chichester is also one of the many who advocated the deliberate creation of famine amongst the Irish, or, and quoting him again, 1,000,000 swords will not do them so much harm as one winter's famine. Now, Lord Deputy Mountjoy agreed that crop destruction and the creation of a famine were the best way to win the war, but his focus wasn't on killing the Irish. That wasn't what he wanted, but destroying their economy and creating conditions that left O'Neill vulnerable to betrayal. What he wanted was to force someone's hand to turn over O'Neill. However, this wasn't the first famine in the 9 Years' War, not by a long shot. 5 years earlier, there was devastating agricultural collapse in northern Connaught. This was a much smaller scale, but produced descriptions that would not have been out of place in Ulster in 1602. The English muster master and Connacht, Morris Kiffin, specifically mentions so many dead, hunger-starving carcasses of men and women lie spread up and down the fields and ways. 1937 was a period of intense spoiling by the Irish Confederates, and the control of the north of the province was contested by Tyrone's allies and Sir Conyers Clifford, the English chief commissioner. Therefore, this, combined with the poor harvest, was likely the cause of the shortages, and the Irish annals make no mention of the famine in the historiography of the period is equally silent. This famine just gets glossed over, no one mentions it. The declared intention of the Crown's officers to create famine in Ulster and the accounts of civilian victimization in the north has led most analysis of the pacification of Ulster of 1603 to claim that the English were responsible for the famine. Now, it was to be wrong to suggest that destruction of food supplies and property did not exacerbate the hardships of the local population, but it is likewise difficult to claim that the Crown military operations were the sole or even the primary causative factor. There was no systematic crop destruction in Connacht in 1597, but the famine still broke out. The Ulster famine visited both the Irish and the English in the north. The English had some relief from imports from England, but the Irish did not, and they were driven to the extremes of want. And by January 1603, the entire country was facing famine. Now, the onset of famine was far faster than the Crown could have anticipated or could have even achieved. In other scorched earth operations in Munster, the impact of crop destruction was not expected to manifest until the following year, but in Ulster, it was a matter of months. When Mountjoy finally entered Dungannon in 1602, he described the area so eaten that I can hardly live there. And he'd only just crossed the river, so he hadn't destroyed it. By September, it would appear that O'Neill's lands north of the Blackwater were already subject to a subsistence crisis before Mountjoy ever arrived. By September, O'Hagan detailed how 1,000 dead lay between Tullahove and Toome, and 3,000 had died in Tyrone since the start of July. And given that Mountjoy found Tyrone in a poor state when he arrived, and the short time taken for the horror stories to emerge, it was likely that Mountjoy's campaign coincided with an emerging disaster. He certainly made it worse. Don't get me wrong, he made it worse, but he didn't cause the crisis. The demands of O'Neill's war effort appeared to have severely denuded the resources of Tyrone. The Earl moved his forces into Fermanagh in August 1602, prompting Mountjoy to observe that Tyrone's concentration of troops did as much damage to the country as the Lord Deputy's spoiling operations. Concurrent with the campaign in the north, there was a poor harvest in the Peel, with expectations of famine to follow. The inclement weather had damaged much of the crops in Munster, and shortages were aggravated by the Crown's debasement of Irish coinage. It means it couldn't get foreign imports. The imposition of base coins combined with rapid inflation of prices meant that merchants found it impossible to pay for imported goods and commodities. And shortages continued into 1603, with famine and pestilence reported in Dublin in November, and the Irish annals recording starvation throughout Ireland. The famine was island-wide by 1604, suggesting that while the first effects were felt in the active war zones, military activity was not the immediate cause of the unfolding disaster. Depopulation of the countryside, as described in Ulster and elsewhere, did not necessarily mean that everyone had been killed or died from famine or disease. It's possible that many of the inhabitants migrated out of the conflict zones, either to less troubled regions or refuges in woods or upland areas. Due to Crown depredations in the Midlands in 1600, the inhabitants fled to Ulster and didn't return for the end of the year. In direct response to crop devastation, many of the rural inhabitants of Tyrone and Kerry relocated to Armagh and Limerick, respectively. Civilians were reported to have left the country entirely to escape the ravages of war. In 1605, Sir Arthur Chichester referred to refugees in France and Spain, stating that they had escaped Ulster, Munster, and Connacht during the famine at the end of the war. Examples of the misery caused by the famine in Ulster have been regularly deployed by historians to highlight the extreme situation unfolding in the north. One involved attacks by women on children near Newry. They lit fires to attract the children, minding cattle, and when they gathered to warm themselves, the women attacked, killing and eating the children. And now this example of cannibalism is frequently used, almost always used, in the modern literature to underline the horrors of the English scorched earth campaigns in Ulster. But to be honest, it's spurious at best. If you start deconstructing it, you'll see what I mean. For one, why did the women not seize the cattle for food instead of the children? You'd think that would be their first option. Furthermore, the iconic of the cannibalistic crone was a stock feature in folklore tales in early modern Europe, and indeed the Compendium Maleficarium in 1608 depicts just such a scene. Now, Morrison, who wrote the account, had spent most of the 1590s traveling about Europe and the Middle East. Therefore, it was entirely possible that he heard or read about the eponymous witch and crone during his travels. Morrison may have added this to the narrative as a dramatic flourish to what was a decidedly monotonous but brutal phase of the war, but more than likely the story was a metaphor for the barbarism of the Irish. What's actually implanted itself into the narrative of the end of the war is actually just a version of Hansel and Gretel, but it's taken as truth. Now, I told you I was going to be quick through this, and we're coming to the end, so we can have some time for questions. And summing up, it's clear that the Irish military, which brought the power of the English crown in Ireland to the point of collapse, was so close, it wasn't funny, it was so far closer than you'd ever imagine. But it was not primitive or backward. Moreover, the reforms brought about by Hugh O'Neill embraced much advances of continental military revolution, leading to a situation where the Irish were more dependent on firepower than their English opponents. It's unbelievable. Actually, they were so dependent on firepower that there was cases where they could have used, see the old gallows glass and axes, the old melee shock troops. If they'd been available, even in small numbers in some situations, Yellowford would have been a disaster and a calamity. There would have been a couple of occasions where no English would have survived, but it just wasn't there. They transformed too quickly. But this was no colonial backwater conflict centered on the home counties of the Irish lords in Ulster, but one which ranged across Ireland, the island, as O'Neill and his allies aggressively increased their sphere of influence and control. While brutal, the war was not fought in a moral vacuum, and the contemporary customs of war were often applied. I'm not saying, don't get me, there's a lot of work put into the book, but I'm not the definitive work or at the close of the 16th century. Okay, that's me. Thanks for listening. I'll stop sharing this screen, and we'll take any questions if we got any.
Thank you very much, Jim. That was brilliant. Thank you for coming on now. We have a few questions for you. You talked about in 1597, I believe, when there was a battle and there was half a dozen men or a dozen men blown up, and they were given aid by O'Neill.
Oh yeah.
Armagh. Was that unusual at the time, or was that the common practice, or was the aid often given?
It's the
You're breaking up now.
Vast majority of the information is English, and so when you get detail of medical aid, that's the first one I know of. But when I said about there was leniency, far greater leniency given by O'Neill to deserters. I'll use an example of up in Derry, the garrison during 1600. O'Neill made a proclamation that deserters could leave the garrison, come to Dungannon, hand over their equipment, then O'Neill would give them a pass and money and sent to the north coast, where O'Donnell would transfer them back to England. And there were so many sent to Scotland that the English petitioned James VI of Scotland to make it illegal for Scottish lords to have deserting English soldiers as tenants, and that's where they were coming from. O'Neill would literally ship them over because it was easier to ship them out of the country than it was to kill them. So there was a pragmatism that O'Neill needed to be okay to surrender. It needed to be okay to give up.
Very good. I didn't hear that before. That's very good. Okay, so first question about the Irish who joined the English, such as the McCartneys in Kerry. Do you know anything about the makeup?
About the McCartneys themselves?
Yeah.
I really did. They didn't give me a chance to go into individual local details. You will notice with the book that it focuses very much on the key themes because they just don't give you the time. Would I have liked to get into things like the O'Byrnes and Wicklow into greater detail? You better believe it. Would I have liked to get into more detail like with O'Sullivan Burr and all the Munster Lords? You better believe it. But they just don't give you the time. You've got to really focus. So hopefully what I'm hoping is that people will look at what I've done and they'll go, well, what's happening where I am? And they can go and look at it and they can drill into it and they can go to the places. And hopefully that's the sort of what I hope people to do. And they can answer those questions to themselves. which is a bit of a weak answer. So no, I don't know that level of detail for.
Yep, that's okay. So does Jim consider the adoption of the sword and target by the English was due to Irish influence later in the war? And might the increased use of the basket-hilted swords by the English later in the war also be due to Irish influence?
Well, I couldn't actually mention the basket-hilted swords, but what I could say is that the adoption of the targeteers and the swordsmen is definitely influenced because the Irish deployed. You can see it in the yellow Ford illustration where you can see. Hold on, I'll see if I can share it here. I'll show it. I can share a screen again. Okay, is that sharing now? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, I'll show you now. See here. Oh, hold on, I can't see it.
Yeah, it's a blank screen at the minute, Jim. Yep, there you go.
Okay, we're good now.
That's
Okay,
yellow Ford.
I'll bring up the yellow Ford here. See here, that we got pointing out here. Those are all targeteers mixed in with the shot, and essentially they avoid close protection to the shot so that no one can come out. You don't see any of that with the English. See, the English shot are all out on their own.
It's gone past it there, but we are know where we are.
Yeah, no, that's the English shot there, and the English shot don't have that level of close protection, and you get the Earl of Essex in 1599 mentions about how effective these are, and asks for some to get sent over, and he gets a letter going back going, no, that's far too dear. But by the next year, you see Mountjoy, and he's actually deploying them in about the same numbers that O'Neill is. They'll to give that security to the skirmishers. So yeah, the English actually very much copy what O'Neill's doing, and O'Neill's actually doing it because he takes it from Spanish practice.
Yeah. Another next question is: are you speaking Uhlans?
Am I speaking Uhlans?
Yeah.
Some people say I'm barely speaking English. Never mind Uhlans.
I know that. I know. Okay. So do we know what, if anything, of the what do we know of the 60 crown prisoners at Armagh who were in custody defected to the Confederates in that particular instance?
Oh, no, they didn't defect. They were sent. There was another 300 that did defect. There was 300 Irish troops in English pay that defected, plus 2 of them were English defected to Tyrone side. But the 60 that were wounded, they were sent back to Newry. One of the officers that was actually captured, injured, that was a guy, Captain Cosby. He was actually imprisoned, but then swapped on a prisoner transfer later on in the war, and actually was then on to serve at the Battle of the Curlew Pass, where he absolutely panics, probably has some PTS freakout, and actually his whole company panics, and is actually part of the collapse in the Curlew Pass in 1599. So yeah, the prisoners, there is decent treatment of the prisoners, who you actually, in the case of Cosby, returned to action.
Yeah. Another one, who were the Anglo-Irish families that were fighting the Irish during this period? Those are
who were they?
Yeah.
You'll have like the Bagnalls, and you have like the Ormond and all the rest of that. You should really be asking my friend Ruth over in Liverpool Hope. She's the expert on the Old English, Ruth Canning. She'd be able to tell you all like the Earl of Delvin and people like that. And that's actually one of the problems, that you get lesser, like the Nugents and younger sons that actually join the Confederates. But the key point about the Old English is that for the most part they don't join with the Irish Confederates. That's one of the key things that causes the failure of the whole thing in the first place. If the Old English had came on in the sort of numbers that Tyrone had hoped for, it would have been a very different story.
And then you have 40 years later when they're fighting again on the other side.
Are you kidding? You have 1 year later?
1 year,
just
right,
the year after the war. That's where you have the recusant revolt, where the war is over, and then you have the Old English Catholics start realizing they're going to get ill treatment, and then they start to think about joining the war. It's like, well, you sort of missed that boat.
Okay, so you've Dan Sands here, and he asked an interesting question. Son, he's read in the book years ago. He says that he read about children eating the intestines of the dead mother. Would that have been a likely example of cannibalism, or did you even hear about that? Did you?
Oh yeah, I'd actually had that in the initial when I first done this lecture before, but I had to cut it out for length. That's another one of the ones. It's a fabrication because in the account he mentions about how they'd been cooking the mother for 8 days, and now they'd actually got their, so they'd eaten their feet, and now they were eating their intestines. But if you start to deconstruct it, when a human body dies, the first thing to decay is the intestines because of the bacteria in it. So it's an impossibility. The intestines would be long mush by the time they were actually eating it. So again, it was just another graphic story to show the barbarism and the plight of the Irish. So I think that's another fabrication.
Well, my example would be cows, you know, there'd be some smell of it after 8 days.
Exactly. Yeah, it's just made up.
You know? But another one here is Joe McCoy says, fantastic hot talk. Was there a battalion of English foot in O'Neill's army, which was sent to him by Elizabeth before the hostilities began, and when he was fighting for the English? So was there a regiment already here in O'Neill's?
It wasn't. It wasn't a regiment. It was a unit of officers, the so-called butter captains, that O'Neill had to train his men before when he was still seen as loyal. Actually, he still had them up to 1594. Okay. But then there's an amount later in 1594. There's a letter comes out of Dungannon to say that O'Neill dismissed all his English officers and all his English soldiers and sent them to Dublin. And he actually sends a letter of recommendation. It's Lieutenant Michael Marshall, who was the leader of O'Neill's foot band, and he gets dismissed, but with a shining letter of recommendation for further employment.
Oh, very good. Okay, so what happened to Mountjoy? Do you know where he's buried?
He did quite well. He would have did quite well if he lived far longer. He's made the Earl of Devonshire. And not long after, very soon after O'Neill's submission in Mellifont in 1603, the pair of them go off to see the new king. And they travel to see James VI and First of England and Scotland, and they go hunting with him. But he lives, I think it's only about 1606, 1607. So I think it's 1606 he dies. I'm not quite sure where, but he's buried in England. But yeah, his health was almost destroyed by Kinsale. They always say about, excuse me, why was there a big pause after Kinsale when O'Neill was defeated? And one of the answers is Mountjoy gets really ill, and it takes him about 2 months to recover. And probably it was that phase that his health was ultimately compromised, so he dies pretty quickly. He was actually quite an ally of Tyrone's after the war, and if he'd lived much longer, there probably wouldn't have been a flight of the Irish because he would have provided cover for O'Neill. Right. You wouldn't have had people like Chichester and Davies gone for him.
Yeah. So one here, great presentation. And what numbers were the Highland mercenaries or Highland Scots mercenaries involved, and what contribution did they make to O'Neill's successes? Sorry.
Very little, actually. He has them. They're deployed during the Fort of the Biscuits when O'Neill was technically still on the Queen's side, but his brother and troops out of Tyrone. And there was definitely red shanks there because that's the mention about the Joan Kelly gets rescued by them. And there's some mention of them Clontibbret, but O'Neill doesn't like using them, and they follow. They're not really. There's actually this dispute with Clan Lord Donald in Scotland that interrupts the supply, but O'Neill doesn't like using them because they're not disciplined enough, and so he doesn't really use them that much, and they don't really have much of an impact throughout the war. Certainly not much after 1595.
Okay.
Even though the MacDonalds, red shanks from Scotland were cut off, but MacDonalds of the North Coast were allied with Tyrone. And it was actually some of the most named officers that were killed at Kinsale were MacDonalds.
And I suppose you could say the same for the Galapagos.
Yeah, well, the Galapagos just doesn't disappear. It's not like someone says, sorry lads, we don't need you, off you go. They were still used, but their whole weapon system had changed. There's one mention about how all the Cairn were turned to shot and the Galapagos became pike, which I think is a bit of an oversimplification. But yeah, the whole weapon system changed. The guys were still there, still employed, but the weapons and techniques they were using were totally different.
Okay.
That's actually one of the things that I would press, that one of the issues is how adaptive was Irish society, and one of the things was that you have a vested interest organization, no, not group like the Gallo Glass, and the whole military methodology of the Irish is transformed almost overnight. In 10 years, it's irrecognizable.
Okay.
And that's how open to change they were.
There's a question here: why were they not utilized more during the 9 Years' War? I suppose you've sort of answered that, haven't you?
Yeah, it's just they changed all they changed so root and branch that they weren't seen to be needed, which is true as long as the gunpowder held out. But when the gunpowder runs out, the fun runs out, and in retrospect, it might have been handy to keep a few, but of course that's retrospect for you.
Okay, another one here from Brian. What are your thoughts on why O'Neill pulled away from the Moira Pass after successfully holding it in 1600? A very strategic piece of ground to let go of.
It's easy to criticize, but the fact is that if you'd been sitting out in the rain tonight, he was having to sit out in the rain just like Mountjoy. Now, his men might have had better fieldcraft, but they were still in the field. And there's every possibility that Mountjoy might have tried an outflanking march. And once he pulled away from the pass, how long was O'Neill going to stay there? So he literally had to pull back. Plus, he'd already, there was plans for that, doing the same thing to Essex the year before. And the plan wasn't to stop them at the Moray Pass, but to stop them at the barricades up near Margaret Hill. And he'd already stopped them there in May. And so there's every possibility that we're just going to pull back there. And when Mountjoy does come back in November, he only gets as far as Mount Norris, which is just south of the barricades that stopped him before. So the plan still worked. And Mountjoy's campaign in 1600, because he dies of death, for the cost of most of it, half his army at least.
Yeah. Okay, there's one here about the Plantation of Ulster. The plantation was being planned and about to be implemented in Ulster and further south. Was there any impact upon the ongoing campaign? I suppose the campaign of Ulster wasn't being planned. It wasn't planned until 1608 when the two Scottish lords came about. So
you can't plan a plantation when you still get the lords. When the political leadership is still there, you can't take lands. There's no method for just taking their lands when they're not proven disloyal.
So it was a different regime.
James wasn't going to. Yeah, James was a pragmatist as well, and he wasn't. But once they left, it leaves it wide open. There is no ownership under English law, so they can do with it as far as they're concerned. They can do with it as they like. And people always say, "Well, was O'Neill forced out? Was he chased out?" And says, "Well, probably he shouldn't have kept up contacts with Spain, offering to start another war."
Suppose there's a well, some people think that the plantation or the 9 Years' War, and then it was the Plantation of Ulster, was because of the 9 Years' War.
No, not at all. It was because it was after it was Chichester and Davies and trying to force O'Neill out, and O'Neill trying to keep political ties with Spain.
And then it was the
I often get actually the Treaty of Belfast was really quite generous. Like it was almost like no harm, no foul. But you have to remember that people say, "Oh well, they pestered O'Neill and were trying to do anything to get him." And that's true. Actually, Davies and Chichester were, but you also have to remember that O'Neill, the ink was no sooner dry on the Treaty of Belfast, and O'Neill was off to meet James with Mountjoy while he was on it going to England with Mountjoy to have all bonhomie with James. He wrote a letter to Philip II of Spain, going, "By the way, if you want another war started, I'm your man." So.
Save us some money. To what extent did Tyrone and the Southern Confederates like McCarthy's engage in joint military operations?
What O'Neill normally did is, because remember, O'Neill went to Munster at the start of 1600, where he met up with McCarthy and James Fitzthomas. And what he normally did is he bolstered their military by giving them troops under O'Neill's officers. So even though they were under their control, they still had O'Neill's officers. So Fitzthomas had already mentioned that basically our strength is because of O'Neill, so we have to do what he wants. It was, even though they were technically in control. So that's how O'Neill got what he wanted done when he got it wanted done. Unfortunately, it was Florence McCarthy. He had to write to Florence McCarthy and tell him that would he cooperate with James Fitzthomas. Florence was being a bit too cute and trying to play both sides, and doesn't really play the coordination game. It's probably one of the weaknesses of the war in Ulster.
Question about Kinsale. How much longer do you think the English could have continued had they lost?
Another week and there wouldn't have been a horse worth using. They would have had to send them away. That's the whole, how long would he have waited? You're starting to get into counterfactual history, but yeah, the English were at the end of their tether as well. And again, retrospect, you'd say, Jesus, just another week. But again, that's retrospect for you.
Yep. Good on. There's one here about why did the Irish pike and shot squares fare so poorly at Kinsale when Hugh O'Neill had 15 Spanish military instructors teaching Irish for 5 years prior, and an Irish sergeant major sent back from Flanders, Tertius?
The Tertius? Oh, I'll tell you why. Because remember, Stanley created like a hybrid. It wasn't. They didn't. His pike and shot weren't just like pike and shot from the continent, because the English had been spending years fighting pike and shot in the continent. They could fight those. The O'Flaherty's in 1589 had Spanish captains who trained them in pike and shot, and the first time they came up against the English, they got hammered because they were fighting just like close order pike and shot. What Tyrone did was he created loose order pike, light pike, what the Spanish would call pica seca, who weren't designed to fight in close order. They weren't designed to have shock. Essentially, they were basically like a mobile screen, and they had to be let loose because to move as quickly with the loose order shot, they had to be loose. So they weren't the same type of pike and shot. And so ultimately, they were like a mobile screen and could provide protection from the horse, while O'Neill's skirmishers, loose order skirmishers, basically wore them down until they broke, and then you'd unleash the cavalry and the sword and buckler men, and that's when all the killing happens. So what they had was a system modified to work within the Irish landscape, and that's how they could maneuver. That's how the English in almost every field situation seemed really flat-footed compared to the Irish, because they can move, and they just were so much slower. And that's what you see Carew later says, but our men are so much faster than the Spanish because they'd copied the Irish, even though the Irish were still faster than them still. Where it comes to in Kinsale is what they've done is they've thrown them into big 2,000-man pike stands, which they're not designed for. Two big 2,000-man pike stands are meant to have like a big central pike block surrounded by shot. You're talking about 50% pike. No, a 1-to-1 ratio of pike to shot. O'Neill's men weren't like that. O'Neill's men were 80% shot. You just didn't have the pike mass for that to work. So either they'd given some shot at pike, which they'd never used, or you just don't have enough pike to create the mass of an effective tertiary. What soldiers, even modern soldiers, are saying you fight the way you train. And they were being asked to fight in a way they'd never fought before. Yeah. So as soon as it starts to fall apart, it literally falls apart.
Get on. That was good. Nolan here, you mentioned the war was a defensive one, as is commonly fought. What would you say the purpose was?
Sorry, what was that again?
You mentioned that the war wasn't a defensive one, as is commonly fought. What would you say the purpose was?
The purpose of the war? I don't quite understand the question.
No, neither.
The reason why it seems defensive is because it allows you to they keep the English concentrated on a shooting war.
Okay.
And it keeps their attention. But while they've got military force concentrated where the war zones are, O'Neill sends people on raids to force political concessions before political answers. So actually the war is won politically, not militarily, which the English just couldn't get their heads around.
Yeah. So I have one here from Jason. Since writing your article in Irish Archaeological in 2014 about earthworks employed by the Irish and the lack of digs research to find any. Have any new works of the era been found?
Not that I'm aware of, actually. Not that I'm aware of. To tell you the truth, I don't. The only excavations I know of would be like at Mountjoy. I know the Queens are digging out Mountjoy and places like that, but I don't know there's been any excavations at any site. There's been no excavations at places like the Moray Pass or something like that, where you know these places are. Nothing like that. I wish there was an excavation at Moray Pass. I'd love that, but no, not that I'm aware of.
Yeah. Another one here. What was Shane McBrien's role in the war?
Shane McBrien. To tell you the truth, I couldn't answer on individuals off the top of my head at the minute.
Okay. One here. How much help did O'Neill get from Scotland, and where did O'Neill get his guns and ammo from?
They answered it themselves there. Scotland mostly. We know that huge amounts of arms and munitions were coming in from Scotland through the north coast, through the MacDonalds. And we know that O'Neill had factors in Glasgow. And we know that Elizabeth had threatened, now she sent James a subvention of something like £4,000 a year, and she'd threatened to take that off him if he wouldn't stop O'Neill buying gunpowder in Glasgow. So much was coming through there. I'd say the majority of O'Neill's gunpowder and weapons were coming through Scottish merchants in Glasgow, though there were cases where he'd actually managed to buy them in London, and he'd also bought a huge amount of merchants in the south whose obvious loyalties might have been to the crown, but like I said, Robocop, good business is where you find it. So there's a lot of people willing to make a lot of money out of it.
Trade. And I suppose 20 years previous, England was at war with Scotland in Ireland. Wasn't that right?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Well, yeah, they frequently hostile and frequently wary of them as well. Even at this stage, they were comments on, let's use the Scots. We can use the Scots. And people were like, serious? No, they were not keen at all to get the Scots involved in this war. And it's only, the Scots only really, one of the things, it's a theory I have on it that even though some people say this war was like a proxy war for Spain and England, no, Spain and England have been at war for years. And Philip III was sent in arms to Ireland and sort of providing political support the Irish lords to have this war to preoccupy England, to stop them sending troops to the Low Countries and France. Also, though, it could be conceived that this war was also a proxy war for James VI in Scotland, because his succession to the English throne was threatened, some thought, by the Infanta of Spain. And so if he allowed this war to be fed through Scottish arms and allowed it to burble on until Elizabeth died, there was no threat from the Spanish Infanta, because while they're at war with Spain, there's no way anyone even links to Spain is going to be considered for taking the crown after Elizabeth dies. And we actually see that in 1602, when the Cecils contact James and say, basically, you're the man once Elizabeth pegs it, then you see actual moves made against the Scottish arms merchants in Glasgow, and people start going to jail, and the arms supplies get cut off from Scotland in 1602. And O'Neill can't rebuild. There's nothing to build with, because there's no arms, no munitions, no nothing coming from Scotland. So yeah, Scotland's got a huge involvement in it. It's actually the great unwritten histories of this section is the involvement of Scotland in this period before James becomes king.
Just shows you the difference in industrialized the state of Ireland compared to Scotland and England. You know, it was Ireland's buying from Glasgow. Why wasn't Ireland buying from Derry or Belfast? You know, it just wasn't the industries.
There wasn't the industry. There wasn't the industries, but it was developing. There was seeds of it. We see it with O'Neill brings over gunsmiths from Scotland and sets up gunsmiths workshops in Dungannon. And we know there was gunpowder getting manufactured in Dungannon and letters written down to Munster when they were saying, well, how do we secure gunpowder supplies? And one of the letters written was, "Why don't you manufacture gunpowder in Munster like they do in Dungannon?"
Very good.
So there was a nascent manufacturing in the offing, but it was truncated by war. So then people think, no, see, the Irish, they were all just arable. No, that was all just cows. But no, there was a lot more to it.
Yeah. Okay. Wee question here. It's not war specific. I had not heard about a famine in this period. Do you think it was caused by warfare or any other conjecture? What would the normal diet have been?
The famine in they're talking about the famine in Munster, the one that didn't really get reported.
Well, I think it was one in Tyrone now. So they were talking about.
Oh, the 1602-03 one. Yeah, it's maybe it's not as well reported. And yeah, O'Neill actually reported there was meant to be 60,000 people were meant to have died, and that's where often you get these reports of empty landscapes, which actually proliferate into the modern day. You know, where people are talking about plantations and say, "Oh, but there's no one there." It's actually, well, actually there was people there. It's actually, I've even heard some people quote the oh, there was only 40,000 people in Ulster when the plantation started, which is absolute liar, pants on fire. Just shocking. If you look at the populations, the estimates of population with anything up to 1 million in Ireland, and people are saying, oh, well, it's 40,000 in Ulster, which is nonsense. Because if you look at one of the metrics I use for that is troops recruitment. And if you look at, say, 6,000 troops could be recruited in Ulster just from O'Donnell and O'Neill. That's not including the ones that were recruited by the English. No country in Europe could recruit more than 5% of the population. That was the Low Countries could recruit 5% because they had industrialization, all the rest that they could afford the manpower. England and France never managed to recruit more than 2.5% of their population. So if you see 6,000 as 2.5% of the population of Ulster, then you might get a better idea of how many people were in Ulster at the time. And even when you take that 60,000 off that might have died in the famine, even if you take off the amount that might have left with the Irish Lords, the sequel, or what might have left, you still, again, the vast majority of the population is never really written about because no one writes about the Churls because they're basically, they're either under Irish lordship or they're under English landlords, but either way, they've still got to pay their rent to someone.
In relation to the famine business there, you know, there was nearly a famine every 20 years in Ireland, you know, up until the big famine. You know, there's a big one.
Yeah, famine's it's a really big one in the 1730s, I think it was as well.
And then one 1818, you had a big one there, 1816 to 18. No one talks about it. There's always the big
these things happen all the time. It's just you get the one in Ulster because you get Arthur Chichester's really lurid descriptions, and people jump on and go, just see what's happening. Yeah. But then the famine spreads south, and no one cares because you can't blame anyone for that famine. That just happens.
Yeah. And then you have the Annals of Ulster. It also mentions about cannibalism during.
Oh yeah, yeah. And I'm not saying it didn't happen. I'm just saying that the key drivers in the historiography are weak foundations.
So the Battle of Kinsale was the Battle of Kinsale lost by the Irish because of a cluster of earls by the Irish, such as O'Donnell, got lost, poor communication between the Spanish and Irish forces, and the Irish commanders surrendering for whiskey?
I think Harm Morgan's put the bottle of whiskey. I think they put a nail in it years ago. So that one's, I think, out the window. I've been on that battlefield with Harm Morgan and Damien Shields, which are probably the most knowledgeable people on that battlefield I know. We walked the ground a few years ago. We still can't agree on what happened, which isn't a really useful answer. The O'Donnell getting lost, I find a bit weak because he basically walking a mile in the dark and he gets lost, but yet he can go over the Sea Fell Mountains in the freezing cold in the dark for 40 miles and doesn't get lost. Yep. And remember, this is in a siege site. The place is lit up. These siege camps and these towns aren't dark. No one switches the lights out at night. They've got campfires. They've got beacon lights. They've got sentry posts, which are all lit up. You cannot get lost. Never mind the fact that every soldier that's actually got a firearm has got a lit match. This week glowing match. So they're getting lost. Why? But we disagree on many different reasons, and we've talked around in circles. But up until something comes up, we can't get a definitive reason. Bad luck is probably the most telling. And if you actually look at classical writers on warfare, and even in the Renaissance in the 17th century, they will say that luck or bad luck is generally one of the largest drivers in battles.
Yeah.
So you could hedge your bets and say bad luck.
Yeah. Brendan Lewis asked, did Hugh O'Neill feature in the 9 Years' War?
He's never mentioned it, but he should have been there. He was of an age, he should have been about 18 or so during the Battle of the Yellow Ford. So there's every likelihood, every possibility he was part of the noble cavalry in there somewhere.
Okay.
Because he was definitely of a status that should have been there, yeah.
Okay. One Seamus there asks, can you speak to the debate of marching to Kinsale? Was it a mistake or was there no choice? Could the war have been eventually won without marching down there?
No, absolutely not. Remember, as much as Mountjoy was in a bad spot, Tyrone was in a bad spot. Mountjoy had been making solid progress. Mountjoy had actually made it to the Blackwater in 1601, and Docker was making inroads, and Chichester was making inroads. So as much as Mountjoy had to withdraw when the Spanish landed, he was already knocking on O'Neill's door. So this was as much a last roll of the dice for O'Neill as it was for Mountjoy.
No choice.
Yeah, he had no choice.
Great lecture, James. Do you believe O'Donnell was reckless at Kinsale by attacking the English when victory seemed so likely?
I'm not going to condemn O'Donnell from my safety of my armchair. I'd say that in retrospect, which is always easy in retrospect to go, let's just hang around for another week, lads. But we're not there. We're not under the pressures they're under, and I'm not going to pin it on O'Donnell, put it that way.
Yeah. Okay. At any time, was there any early or indeed any late attempt to end the war, particularly in the light of the impact you described upon the people of the island you spoke of, Dungannon, which is where I am from? What concessions might have been considered by O'Neill, or was that a word? Sorry?
Well, it almost ended in 1596. They'd been given their pardons, no harm, no foul. And O'Neill and O'Donnell and Maguire had agreed them all. But they were just playing for time. And if the Spanish didn't turn up, well then, it's been fun, lads, but let's get back to business. But then the Spanish did turn up in May 1596, and I went, right, lads, war's back on.
Okay. Peter Kelly has an interesting question here. Is there any proof that Ormond tested positive for coronavirus?
I don't know. He's fairly jammy, Ormond, so probably not. If he did, it was definitely a slight case.
Yeah. Martin says events in Kerry at that time were not covered in deeds, not words, or covered in deeds, not words, published recently.
Mm-hmm.
I had read, or Brian says, I had read that Hugh O'Neill had called for truces and received truces. Is that true?
Happened all the time, yeah. That's what just saying about 1596. What he always did, he used truces aggressively. People always think that a truce is peace, but it's not. It's nothing like it. It's basically biding time, or you use truces to move troops to the wrong part of the country, or use truces to try and draw people out into the open. Yeah, just because it's a truce, it's the Game of Thrones has got nothing to teach Hugh O'Neill or O'Donnell.
Yeah.
Just because someone comes with a truce doesn't mean.
Yeah, there's another one here saying that he could have had a Braveheart movie made after him, or maybe should in the future have a big feature film.
I think it'd be pretty awesome. Bit of a miniseries. Even though I wouldn't have him as the main character, would have say a side one like Maguire or someone related to Maguire. So you're right at the start, and
maybe you're looking for a job.
Maybe if I'm always looking at a job.
Get on. Mike Fitzsimmons completely changes my recollection of history as I was taught it. Really interesting. Thank you, Mike Fitz. You mentioned how the English you mentioned how the English copied Irish tactics, such as the use of targeteers. Do you have info if the English then used those tactics and techniques in the America fighting against Indians?
Short answer is no. I never got a chance to follow it up. I decided that I'd let someone else pick up that torch and carry it on.
Okay, Barry asks, he says, thank you for the presentation. Are your notes from it going to be online anywhere? We'll put this recording online probably tomorrow on Transnatira or Lombardy Area Ancestry website for everybody to watch over again. In your book, you called Hugh Maguire's revolt Tyrone's proxy war, with Tyrone able to essentially direct this war while staying seemingly loyal to the crown. However, what isn't clear is why would Hugh Maguire agree to jump into a war with England, trusting O'Neill, who could easily have left him high and dry at the mercy of the English?
Well, for one thing, he's Hugh's son-in-law, and he didn't do anything with his own forces. His own forces weren't his own forces. His own members sent about to get reinforced by O'Neill's troops. Everything Maguire had was under Cormac Baron, O'Neill's brother. And all his main forces were from him, and this was their plan from the outset. And they'd already seen what had happened in the McMahon lordship in Monaghan, how it was broken up, and the Bingham was already eyeing up for Monaghan, and there's already competition from other Maguires, and so I'd say that this was part of the plan from the beginning. That basically this was their how they would secure their position. This isn't about freeing Ireland. This was about securing their patrimonies, and to do that they had to do it for everyone for it to be secure for good. So if they were going to get what they want, it had to be across the whole country. They had to get rid of the whole English government and rule. So remember that they weren't actually getting rid of things. They were actually just swapping the sovereign. They were looking to swap it for a Spanish one.
Mark Dougherty asks, is it true that the current Queen of England is a blood relative of Hugh O'Neill?
Well, it's blood relative, like everyone's a blood relative of Genghis Khan or something like that. It is true, though, that through the Bowes line, it's one of Tyrone's daughters married into the Scots aristocracy. I think it was one of the MacDonalds. And it's down through that line that goes down to the Bowes line, the Queen's mother. And through that line is the link to O'Neill
now. Someone says here, you visited the burial place in Rome under a carpet in a church. Could do with a plaque. At least there's a plaque outside that church. If you just look up, you'll see the O'Neill's coat of arms, and there's a wee plaque above it as well. If you go and have a look again,
Oh yeah, we've been there to Rome, the Dan and all. They're still there. It's on the base of the blue carpet. Oh, it's pretty cool. But the big plaque with the O'Neill crest and with the O'Donnell crest isn't for. It's for O'Neill's son, one of the other O'Donnells. O'Neill's actual plaque was put there by O'Rourke. I think it was O'Rourke Hilly or someone like that. And so he's just got a wee small thing called, it sits under the carpet,
Okay, great talk. How long is this before O'Neill sailed to Spain from Ireland to raise extra help?
07.
He went to Spain in 07.
Well, he never got to Spain, remember? He had to go in Low Countries and he walked all the way to Rome. So he never got, though O'Neill never got to Spain. O'Donnell got to Spain.
Yeah. There's a mountain of messages here, or questions. There's so many, but to be honest with you, we really need to wrap it up, Thank you very much.
I could be here all night.
You could be here all night.
No problem.
There's 54 messages. But if anybody
by the
wants
way,
to,
if they want to check out, I have most of my back catalogue of articles on academia.edu. So they go on academia.edu. Hold on a sec here. That should be open. Or I think just a wee sec here. Getting there.
Yeah, you're okay.
And it has my back catalogue of here. I'll share this screen here. There it is. Is that sharing there?
Yep.
All right. And that's got my back catalogue of articles, which you can download and fill your boots if that is the cut of your jib. Because I can't answer all your questions, but there's a fair amount of stuff in there that I can't cover in the space of time available.
Yeah.
So you just go on there and do a search for my name, and you could knock yourself out.
Dead on. Or you could reply when I put this online tomorrow or next day. I'm sure Jim will reply to your message, you know. But I think that's it for tonight, Jim. Thank you very much for coming on to the Transatira and Limavady Area Ancestry. It was very good of you, and maybe you'll come back and answer some of the questions that are left.
No, my pleasure, Stephen. Thanks for having us.
Hey, you're very welcome.
All the best.
So,
Bye-bye.
I'll stop now. Thank you very much again.
Bye.